Hello, I'm Stephen and this video is about my previous hobby, flying radio-controlled aircraft. There's a few pictures to the left here of aircraft that I've built before, just one or two, but this video charts from the beginning of when I started model flying up to the end game of the hobby. I started flying in the spring of 1983 and it was always my end game to build a large radio-controlled B-17. I didn't realise at the time, but I'd end up doing it twice. So this video charts some of the models that I built in the sort of steps towards building the big B-17. It all started in the early spring of 1983, buying a Leicester Model Centre Hunter 29. It was a 3-channel trainer and it used a Futaba 5LK set of radio gear and an OS Max 35 engine. It was all traditional construction and it wasn't ready to fly until May. I took to flying straight away and was talked down to a landing on my second trip out to the club site at Chesley Street. I flew the model for about a year until I knew it inside and out, and with increased control throws I could get it to do things the more complicated models wouldn't do. Eventually the model was destroyed when it was shot down by another pilot switching on using the same frequency. It could have been rebuilt, but by that time I'd already completed my next model. The radio and engine was transferred from the wrecked Hunter into a Monarch Graduator, a low-wing sport aerobatic monoplane. I never got a photograph of the whole model completed in its original scheme, so the small thumbnail shows a photoshopped impression of what it looked like. It was also the first of many models that I had that would carry a camera. The main picture shows the pits area of the club field across the wing of the Graduator. Of course, back in 1984, it was a film camera, none of this fancy digital stuff. It was a Helena 15-shot disc camera, which used a circle of 8x10mm negatives. It was a manual wind-on camera, so it was one picture per flight, and then I had to land to wind the camera on for the next shot. The next aircraft was a Pat French Model's Team Special biplane. I never got any photographs of this model either. It first flew in 1984, but was lost to a power switch failure, diving into frozen winter ground at full power. In 1985 I dabbled a little bit with helicopters, flying this Colt Baronet, or Baron 20 as it was also known. I just about got the hang of hovering, but parts were expensive and a wooden aircraft could be repaired for a much cheaper price than the helicopter, so it was eventually sold on. I also messed around with some novelty models, one being this flying flat iron. It was only 17 inches wingspan and around about 2.5 feet long, powered by an OS 20 FP. It would hover in the slightest breeze and the landing approach and touchdown was around 45 degrees nose high. Also in 1986 I had to go glider flying from an Aerotow. So many people and articles that explained how hard it was, and yet a friend and I cracked it very quickly with my Veron Impala glider and his high-wing 40-power trainer. Most people who tried it went for a high-power haul to get the glider into the air and high as possible, as quickly as possible. With our low-power trainer we soon learned that it wasn't difficult to fly circuits while towing. The glider started out just as a rudder and elevator model with a tow release in the nose. Trying to level the wings also induced a turn while on the tow, so a new aileron wing was built with air brakes as well. The brakes helped to keep some tension in the tow line, and the ailerons allowed the wings to be levelled without changing the heading of the model. We got so proficient, both the tow plane and the glider were often rolled while towing. The glider was another model modified to carry a camera, pointing both forwards looking along the tow line and also vertically down. I had other gliders around this time too. One was this 6-foot span fiberglass and foam ridge racer from Soaring sailplanes. Another glider was this small slope soarer, which started out as a hand-launched thermal glider with a lightweight polyhedral wing. I used that wing for soaring on light wind days, and this aileron air brake wing on very windy days. Since starting to fly, I'd had an interest in building scale models. The first was this semi-scale scratch-built Evans Volksplane, which spanned about 42 inches and was powered by an OS 20 FP engine. I built it with an all-moving tailplane and fin like the real thing. The fin worked fine, but I found a problem with the all-moving tailplane. While flaring on landing, the tailplane would reach its stall angle quickly causing the model to suddenly pitch into the ground. I'd recently read an article in a full-size aviation magazine about turbulators to help control airflow. I wondered if the same thing could work on the model. I glued a 1/4 inch strip of 80 grit sandpaper to the underside of the tail, a little bit back from the leading edge. This created a turbulent boundary layer with more energy, which stayed attached to the tail, and it completely cured the tail stall. The next step towards a big B-17 was a large twin-engine trainer. It was actually an A-level design and technology project at school. It was another camera plane. The layout was loosely based on the F-82 twin Mustang, with a central camera pod and anti-vibration mountings for the camera. This aircraft was finished and flown in early 1988. I'd moved on from the Helena disc camera and was now using a Canon SureShot 35mm automatic wine camera. That gave me up to 36 pictures per flight before I needed to land and change the film. This image catches an extra aerobatic aircraft during the 1988 Wings and Wheels show at Northfield Aerodrome. The camera was mounted vertically down in the camera pod, so oblique pictures were all taken during turns. Since it was a model show and the aircraft needed to be kept low and close to the crowd so they could see them, I wasn't flying particularly high for this shot. This picture is a Beech C-45 at the squadron dispersal on the other side of the airfield to where we were flying. A year later, while flying at the same show, I got several more pictures of this area that perfectly pieced together with the original image from the year before. The last image from Northfield is this view along the main runway. The old field boundaries can still be seen from before the time of the runway. While not a scale model, the Sierra Sportster had the look of a pit special. It was built by a club member and finished in an all-yellow scheme. He found it hard to fly, but gave it to me after I managed to tame it. A little while later, it was stripped down and recovered in paste petroleum pit special colours. Now for some more semi-scale models. Scale modelling was in my blood. I had several fun fighters in the late 80s. Messerschmitt 109, Spitfire, Fokker 190. They were all from the original Cambria kits. The P-51 Mustang was from after the company was sold and became Cambrian. The Spitfire and Mustang were powered by the OS-20 FP, while the 109 and 190 had an NE 30 engine. The Greenfield Tourer was an own design model, built in 1989, and made to look like a real home-built aircraft, even though it was completely fictional. It did take elements from a number of real home-built aircraft, such as the Emerald and the Jadel. It was powered by an Irvine 61 engine, and it was damaged during a low-level inverted pass after the engine stopped. It was rebuilt into a new Stars and Stripes colour scheme and flew again in mid-1990. Wanting a larger model that didn't suffer from the high price and mess of glow fuel, I designed my first petrol-powered model, which first flew in September 1990. The Evergreen Whatnot was another one of my own designs made to look scale even though it wasn't. It uses an 38cc petrol engine and spanned 7.5 feet. I was driving a Mini Clubman Estate at the time. With the Flying Club lawnmower in the back, the wing went over the top of that and over the top of the front passenger seat. The fuselage was strapped on the roof. The tail of the original model was designed in the sort of shape of the 1930s races, but after a flat spin, the fin and rudder were enlarged. My first true scale model was this quarter scale Fokker EV, which flew in September 1991. I got it as a mostly complete airframe from another club member. He designed it for a geared Weber 61 glow engine, but after that engine was damaged in a crash with another model, he lost interest in the E5 and gave it to me. It was a perfect size for the Zenoa 38cc engine, so after finishing the building and painting, the 38 was pulled out from the Whatnot and fitted into the Fokker. I ended up winning the club team scale competition with it. Team scale allowed a different builder and pilot to enter a model. The wing on the E5 was rolled plywood, which made it very strong but quite heavy. Having so much weight high up made takeoff and landing very tricky, but it was a beautiful aircraft to fly. It never had a pilot fitted because the control column and rudder pedals operated from the same cables that were at the control surfaces. I didn't want to risk jamming the controls with a pilot. I also needed access through the cockpit to connect up the aileron cables to the control column. Now I am getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Scrolling back a few years, in 1988 I began the research and construction of my big B-17. It was scratch built to 1/10 scale, spanning a little bit over 10 feet and was around about 7.5 feet long. It would be powered by 4 Sato 45 4-stroke engines. The construction was fairly conventional, except for the nose compartment, which was made using a fiberglass shell. This allowed a thin wall in the structure with no big formers needed to hold the shape. This in turn allowed plenty of space for detail in the nose. The fuselage and nacelles took quite a long time to build and sand because they were made from 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch balsa planks. It was a long build and it wasn't ready for engine runs until 1993. It was finished in the markings of the 100th Bomb Group aircraft hang the expense. It is seen here doing some engine tests at Chesley Street Club Field in the summer of 1993, though it wasn't quite finished at this point. The B-17 flew for the first time in July that year from RAF Catterick. It is seen here at the Large Model Association fly-in at Duxford in August 1993, at Chesley Street doing engine tests, and also at Catterick during the test flight. Air cadets were gliding at Catterick that evening, so I had to wait until 9 PM before I could do the flight after they had finished. This sunset picture was taken shortly after the flight had been completed. After completion of the model, the way the LMA shows were run changed to 10-minute slots, from 15 minutes of even frequencies and 15 minutes of odd channels. This didn't give me much time to get the glow fuel engines tuned and have the flight before the slot time was over. That and the frequent unpleasant weather at UK model shows resulted in the B-17 being quite impractical for the UK show circuit. Rather than let the model just gather dust, in 1995 the B-17 was placed on permanent loan to the 100th Bomb Group Museum at the home base of the original aircraft. It seemed a fitting place to retire the B-17 to. At the time of filming, the museum at Thorpe Abbotts has been its home now for 27 years, far longer than the original aircraft, which only lasted at the station for around about a month before being destroyed in a takeoff crash. The change in model show format resulted in me wanting an all-weather aircraft that was easy to start and fly, and something that would be reliable. A single petrol engine was the way to go, something with a low wing and a wide landing gear to handle crosswinds. Still fascinated by the US 8th Air Force, the P-47 Thunderbolt fitted the bill perfectly for an all-weather model. There were no kits available that I could afford, so I ended up designing my own. I never draw full-size plans except for wing sections and fuselage formers, with everything else being worked out from a small plan and drawn straight onto the wood. In May 1994, the new 1/6 scale P-47 was complete. It spanned 81 inches and weighed 18 pounds. It was powered by the good old Zenoa 38cc petrol engine, turning a smart 22x8 prop at 6,500 RPM on the ground. The first flight took place on VE Day in 1994 at the Chesley Street Club Field. Around the same time that I was building the P-47, a friend was modifying a Galaxy Models P-51 to make it more scale-like. We planned to display both models together across the 1994 season. We practiced formation flying with the two models, which was a challenge with both aircraft having different power and drag. As August approached, we were asked to attend the press day for the Yorkshire Air Spectacular, a model and full-size airshow at Elvington Airfield. Close formation flying proved too much of a challenge at the low altitude needed for the photographers and the pyrotechnics operator. I ended up flying solo, around 6 feet off the ground, down a narrow corridor at the edge of the runway to avoid the pyrotechnics and stay within shot. The P-47 can be seen near the pyro guy who's dressed in red. The photographers were further to the left out of shot, looking diagonally across the runway towards the P-47 and explosions. This picture took up most of the front page of the Northern Echo in full colour, with the heading "Explosive Drama in the Northern Skies." It was a great advert for the show. It was a stunning picture long before digital imaging was a thing, so the photographers couldn't be 100% sure they got the shot they wanted until the film was developed. The second picture was published in black and white in the Yorkshire Post. I loved the explosion reflecting from the P-47 fuselage, so I must have been pretty close to the bang and a little bit off my centre line for that shot. I contacted both newspapers after the photo shoot for copies of the pictures. At the 1994 shows, we met a guy who was really impressed with the P-47 and the way it flew, and wanted to build one for himself. By this time I'd drawn some full-size plans which I'd been selling at some of the shows. John built a P-47 for himself over that winter, but much modified into a Razorback version. It was ready to fly for the 1995 season and can be seen here in this lineup at the LMA Cosford show in 1995. I'm getting ahead of myself once again. On the way home from the Elvington 1994 show, I was chatting to Andrew, the P-51 pilot, about where our display team was going to go. We had two fighters, a semi-scale Norseman built as a big trainer for my dad, and John, who would be building the P-47. Another B-17 would be nice, especially if it was 1/6 scale to match the fighters. Before building the smaller B-17, I'd done a ton of research, all before the days of the internet. This included a trip to the RAF Museum at Hendon and the Imperial War Museum at Duxford to photograph and measure their B-17s inside and out. In addition to the measurements I took, I also got a copy of the B-17 manual for reference. All of this research was just sitting on my shelves, begging to be used again. 2 weeks after getting home from the Elvington show, wood cutting began, and I'd started on the new 17-feet wingspan monster. 2 weeks after that, much of the front fuselage was built. Due to its size, the new B-17 would break apart at the same sub-assemblies as the full-size aircraft. This would aid both building and transport. Also due to its larger size, the bigger model went together much faster, being able to use 4-inch sheets of balsa rather than small planks to cover the structure. Before the little B-17 went to the museum, it was photographed along with the new Fortress to give a comparison of its size. By early October, most of the fuselage was complete. Despite the larger size, all of the B-17 was built on a bench that was only 3 feet by 6 feet. This is the starboard inner wing panel on the building jig. All of the ribs were fretted out 1/8 inch plywood. In January 1995, 8 of the sub-assemblies were well on the way to being structurally complete. They were the front and rear fuselage and tail turret, port and starboard inner wing panels, and the port and starboard tailplanes and the fin. The outer wing panels were lightened foam cores with wooden spars laid in. The size was becoming apparent by this point. The nacelles are now sheeted and the elevators are also built. One engine has been test fitted to plan linkage routes. By this point, skinning the wooden airframe in fine fiberglass cloth had started. The fiberglass cloth applied with epoxy resin gave a hard, smooth surface to represent the metal skin of the real aircraft. By August 1995, the B-17 was complete enough for test flights, though not quite finished. At the time of this picture, the number 2 engine was still being run in Andrew's P-51. Most of the windows were just painted on for this temporary test flight scheme, and the ball turret and top turrets weren't made. After the Duxford model show in mid-August, the engine was removed from the Mustang and fitted into the B-17 for final engine tests. It took 3 trips to Elvington Airfield to get a successful test flight. A few steering and stopping issues needed addressing first. Each trip was made by transporting the B-17 in my parents' caravan. To do this, it needed to be fully disassembled and took half an hour to unload and an hour to assemble at the airfield. The inner wing panels were the first sections to be fitted. The outer wings were next, then the tailplanes and fin were fitted to the rear fuselage. That was then joined to the front fuselage. Later in the life of the B-17, once I had a custom trailer to transport it, the front fuselage and inner wings would stay assembled permanently. The fin and one tailplane could also stay together in the trailer. Once at a show, I only needed to fit the other tailplane and join the fuselage, add the tail turret and then add the outer wing panels. This cut the assembly down to around about 20 minutes. Here's the B-17 assembled at Elvington and waiting for the test flight. There was a moderate crosswind on the test flight day, so after some range and engine checks, everything was switched off and I just sat and waited. Other people were desperate to see it fly, but I just told them, not yet. After about 45 minutes, the wind turned and ended up almost straight down the runway. Now was the time. The engines were started and run up, and then it was time to head to the runway. It took 2 people to fly the model. As pilot, I had the flying controls and inner throttles. Andrew, my co-pilot, had the landing gear, the flaps and the outer engines on independent throttles. Like the full size, these would help to steer the model on the ground in a crosswind. We were partway through the second circuit when I heard a loud engine and thrashing noise behind us. An RAF Sea King helicopter was storming very low across the airfield and just spotted the B-17. In the video clip that's just finished, where I begin a right-hand turn and lose height, he climbed steeply and did the helicopter equivalent of a stall turn, heading off to take a much wider circuit around the airfield. I wasn't particularly high, so the Sea King must have been around about 150 to 200 feet. Fortunately, I had spotters who were watching as lookouts. The rest of the 10-minute flight was uneventful. The test flight was just 2 days before we were due to be back at Elvington for the bank holiday show. In those 2 days, the glorious summer of 1995 ended, to be replaced by wind and rain for the show. There was a slight bounce on landing, but I was perfectly happy with it for a first flight. Due to the bad weather, I only made one flight with the B-17 at the show. It was either raining or a very strong on-crowd crosswind. At least there was some full-size action to watch too. The show was split into blocks of model flying and then half-hour slots of full-size aircraft displaying. One of these almost destroyed the B-17. There was a strong on-crowd crosswind when the Harrier displayed. As it did its hovering display, slowly drifting along the flight line, the wind was blowing the jet wash towards the crowd and the parked models. The B-17 briefly became airborne, and almost as this was happening, our gang realised what was going on and leapt forward to hold the model onto the ground. Others on the flight line weren't so lucky, and some models have flipped onto their backs, causing damage. Full-size B-17 Sally B was based there for the 3 days of the show. It gave me a chance to get some photographs of the model and full-size together, and also a chance to climb in through the nose hatch wartime style by grabbing the edge of the hatch and swinging my legs up and in. I'm not sure I could manage that these days. This was the last time the B-17 would be seen in its temporary silver scheme. After the Elvington show, I'd started to rub it all down again and to finish it off with the turrets and the detailing that it was missing for the test flights. Like the smaller B-17, the large version was to be finished in the markings of Hangley Expense. I had a piece of the original aircraft which I'd recovered from the crash site, and that was fitted into the nose of the model. The model needed to be sanded back down to the glass skin, then overlapping panel lines built up with filler applied against the edge of some tape. It needed sanding to blend the filler back into the skin. It's date night. Lynn was my girlfriend at the time. It was a cheap night in to sand panel lines, and as there were so many, I really needed the help. It didn't put her off, however, and she did become my wife 5 years later. And 22 years after that, we're still together. 3 years after sanding panel lines, Lynn built a plane of her own. It was the Galaxy Wizard, powered by an OS-20 FP engine. Lynn did about 80% of the building and 60% of the covering on the model. She then learned to fly, which was a useful skill for the model shows in case she needed to take over from me in an emergency. At least she'd be able to crash a model safely away from the crowd if I was incapacitated. After the windows had been added and the surface detailing completed, repainting the B-17 started. Section by section, the B-17 turned from silver to olive drab and grey. Markings and national insignia were applied next. With the B-17 almost done, it was partially assembled in the garden for a pre-season engine and radio test. The aircraft name had been painted by this time. The nose art was the last of the markings to be painted. A small error in the masking between the olive drab and grey ahead of the name is actually a faithful reproduction of the error on the full-size aircraft, seen in the picture posted earlier in the video. Here's the finished B-17 in the garden, in one piece for the first time in the new colour scheme. I really like the patchy olive drab finish, brought about by the use of an airbrush rather than a big spray gun. The airbrush probably gave a more scale-like spray pattern comparable to the full size. It took 14 tins of flare olive drab to paint the aircraft. Slight variations in the batches probably also helped with the paint finish. I always thought B-17s looked better in olive drab, while the B-24 Liberator looked better in natural metal. This video is compiled from several clips by the Norwich Model Club during their 75th anniversary fly-in at RAF Coltishall in September 2003. When the B-17 comes in for landing, listen for this tyre squeal when the wheels touch the ground. The B-17 made 5 flights across the day, the most missions I ever flew in one day. After each flight, I painted a mission symbol on the aircraft, just like the full size would do. Eventually the string of missions stretched back all the way to the radio room. In September 2001, the model team headed off to Norway. We were displaying at a model show very near the Rjukan Valley. During World War II, the Germans had taken over the electrolysis plant there and was producing heavy water, deuterium oxide, as part of their atomic weapons program. By coincidence, the real B-17 Hang the Expense was one of the aircraft on the raid to destroy the factory in 1943. It was a strange feeling to have part of the original aircraft back flying in that area after 58 years. Due to the times of the ferry crossings, we spent almost a week in Norway having a holiday before the show. We stayed on the airfield so we could fly every evening, which was mainly just sports models. The weather wasn't great for the show, but we still had a great time while we were there. Here's a shot of the B-17 at sunset on the Thursday evening test flights. All of the show models were flown once that night to check them over prior to the event. In 1944, one of the other B-17s flown by the Hang the Expense crew made an emergency landing at Seething Airfield, one of the other 8th Air Force air bases. This airfield was also the location for the last flight of the Model B-17 in 2004. It was around this time that I fell ill with asthma brought on by a wood dust allergy. I was constantly out of breath and lost my voice for several weeks. Transporting and operating the B-17 was just too exhausting. I needed to take a complete break from wood dust, both at work and at home. By the time my health returned, 35 MHz radio equipment was no longer allowed at the Large Model Association shows. I would need to buy all new 2.4 GHz radio gear for all my aircraft. I didn't have the money or the interest to do this. I'd achieved the original plan to build a big B-17, and in fact had done it twice, but by this time I'd moved on to a new hobby, full-size military vehicles. In 2012, the B-17 was stripped of its engines and radio gear, and the engines were sold to fund other projects. The B-17 still makes an appearance now and again on static display. It's seen here in these two pictures at the former RAF Breton. This last picture in the video shows the B-17 at the former RAF Croft. It is currently stored in its trailer, and this is where the story ends for now. Thanks for watching.